I am so thrilled to be joined now by an old friend of mine and very impressive person, Jessica Roth, who is a professor of law at the Cardozo School of Law. Jessica, thank you so much for taking the time today.
It's my pleasure.
So, today, the federal judge in the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case heard arguments again from the federal government and from his lawyers in this ongoing struggle around whether the government is going to facilitate his return to the U.S. Can you catch us up on what happened in that hearing?
Sure. So going into this hearing, the court had directed the government to give her information, namely answers to her questions about where Mr. Garcia was presently, what steps the government had undertaken thus far to facilitate his release from custody in El Salvador and return to the United States, and what efforts the government was going to take on a going forward basis to facilitate his release. The government has essentially provided her with no information in response to those orders. And so today at the hearing, she was reiterating that the government was responsible for complying with her order, that it answered these questions. And according to the reporting, she grew very frustrated with the DOJ's efforts to essentially turn the hearing into something else other than whether the government was responding to her order. And so what she did is basically say, you're going to respond to my questions, and there's going to be discovery, meaning you're going to have to provide information in the form of documents, and you're going to provide witnesses from the US government to sit for depositions taken by the plaintiff's counsel to try to get to the bottom of really what's been happening. What, if any, steps is the US government undertaking to try to facilitate the release of Mr. Garcia?
Would you explain the Supreme Court has said that the government has to comply with this request?
Yes, the
Yes.
Supreme Court affirmed the trial court's order in part. And what it said was that the trial court properly required the government to provide information about its efforts to facilitate the release of Mr. Garcia from El Salvador custody and to essentially return him to the status quo before he was wrongfully sent to El Salvador. And the court said that there were limits to what the district court could order and that she could not require the US government necessarily to make sure that he arrived in the United States, because some of that may in fact be beyond the United States government's control. And the Supreme Court also said that any orders from the trial court judge should be mindful that the executive branch has primary responsibility for the conduct of foreign affairs. But taking all of that into account, the Supreme Court did affirm that the trial court properly entered an order requiring the production of information and that the US government needed to make efforts to facilitate the release of Mr. Garcia.
So, can we just break this down? And the government's playing cute, and they're saying, for example, well, we would facilitate his return if El Salvador wanted to return him, but President Bukele was at the White House and he said he doesn't want to return him and can't return him. And, they gave a bunch of different reasons. The government has, in other cases, and even in part in this case, alleged that some things are classified and they can't share that with the court. So, if the Trump administration continues to sort of gaslight and slow walk the court on all this stuff, what recourse is there?
Yeah, so I think that ultimately what we're going to be talking about is whether sanctions are going to be imposed on officials with the US government. The problem here is that the judge doesn't know exactly who's responsible for what. And she's
Oh.
getting very sort of cursory affidavits being sent in response to her requirement of daily updates that essentially are, double hearsay, right? An official saying, I hear from people in country that he is being held in a certain place. So she needs to find out exactly who's responsible for any efforts or non-efforts to date to try to secure Mr. Garcia's release, so she could even know who she might actually impose sanctions on. And until she gets more information about the individuals responsible, we're sort of not yet at that step.
Got it. What are sanctions in this context?
Yeah. So in this context, it could be an order just finding that the government is in contempt. Now, that may not have any teeth in this context with a government that is unwilling in the first place to obey a court order. But in other contexts, a finding of contempt could in and of itself be coercive and something that would prompt government officials acting in good faith to try to correct their course of action. It could also be fines intended to actually prompt the government officials in question and the government agents in question to change course. Civil contempt is designed to basically be coercive, not punitive. The intent is to change the contemnor's behavior by imposing sanctions and increasing the sanctions if necessary as the contempt continues, with the hope and the expectation that eventually the pressure will be enough to force a change in behavior.
What would make this go back to the Supreme Court, for the Supreme Court to say, we ordered you guys to do this, you're not doing it, we're telling you again, do it. You're in defiance of our order.
So I fully expect this case is going to go back to the Supreme
Got it.
Court at some point, perhaps right away. I mean, at this point, the court has said that there's going to be discovery, the production of documents, depositions, interrogatories where the government officials have to answer questions that are put forth by the plaintiff's counsel over the course of the next 2 weeks. And then she's effectively invited a motion for contempt by the plaintiff's counsel. I expect that the government is going to seek to stay that order and immediately appeal the order of discovery so that they don't actually have to provide the information or the witnesses for depositions. The question is whether the higher courts will actually grant them that stay and take the immediate appeal, or whether the government will have to wait and see what happens going forward, including whether anybody from the government is actually held in contempt before it goes to the Supreme Court.
Wow. Is this a constitutional crisis?
It may well be, because if in fact the Supreme Court holds that the trial court properly understood the Supreme Court's order, affirming the trial court's order that the government needed to provide this information about what it was doing and also take steps to facilitate the release of Mr. Garcia. So if the Supreme Court basically agrees with the trial court about what the government is required to do pursuant to the court's orders, and the government still refuses to take those steps as required in the orders authoritatively construed by the United States Supreme Court, then yes, we are in a constitutional crisis.
We're like on the doorstep of one right now, but we're not really fully in it until they overtly defy an order by the court to comply. Yes?
I think that's a fair statement, because they currently have an argument that's, I think, too cute by half about how they are in compliance with the court's order properly understood.
Right. If the government, and we're a little speculative here, but if the government does defy, one of the things we hear alleged by politicians and by pundits on TV is that if the government can take Abrego Garcia off the streets and send him to this prison, there's nothing to stop them from doing that to anyone. And in fact, the president said in the Oval Office yesterday, I'd like to see homegrowns, meaning American citizens who the government deems terrorists, also deported to El Salvador. Is there anything to stop them from doing that once they've defied the courts?
Well, the problem with the argument that the government has been putting forward in this case is that it really doesn't have a logical limit in terms of the people as to whom the government could take into custody, send to a foreign country, and then essentially say, our hands are tied in terms of our ability and our requirements under law to get them back. That does extend to US citizens. And so that is really a terrifying thought. And so I would say that if the Supreme Court were to uphold that proposition, that is something that is deeply, deeply disturbing. And if the Supreme Court holds that that's wrong, but nevertheless the government makes no effort to get Mr. Garcia back, then we have the constitutional crisis sort of on top of everything else we've been talking about.
Okay. So I just want to assure people listening to this, that scenario I laid out where they deport American citizens out of the country, we're not there. That's not happening right now. It's a notion that seems to it seems possible given what the administration is saying, but don't freak out about that just yet. I want to ask one last question, which is, does the Supreme Court have any additional power to force compliance by the government? You said that the federal judge could hold someone in contempt. Let's say they defy her and this goes to the Supreme Court, and they also defy the Supreme Court. What can the justices do?
I don't think the justices have any independent sort of additional power on top of that, that frankly the judiciary as a whole possesses, and to hold somebody in contempt. Um, because it's the same issue, which is contempt of court. If the trial court holds the government in contempt and the Supreme Court upholds, right, that finding because it agrees with the district court's holding, then essentially the government is in contempt of the judiciary, and
As
it
a
has,
whole.
as a whole.
I see. Could they find, let's say they can't tease out who is personally responsible, could they just hold Attorney General Bondi in contempt or the border czar Tom Homan?
So this is an area that's really pretty unsettled. There
Mm,
is some precedent for holding entire agencies in contempt,
mm.
but I think that the case law sort of on appeal of that is a bit mixed. So usually we don't get to this. I do think that it's going to be very interesting to see how sort of the layers of the onion are peeled back in the discovery process to figure out who actually has information about how decisions are being made, about whether to and what steps or none to take to facilitate Mr. Garcia's return. I don't anticipate that the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, is going to be brought in for a deposition, but it's also possible that nobody else has information and answers until we get to the highest levels.
Wow. Could they disbar the lawyers arguing the case if they refuse to comply, or that's not a thing?
Well, if the lawyers are not being candid, right, and are not complying with their legal obligations, including orders of the court, then the lawyers individually could be held in contempt of court, but they also could be referred for bar discipline
Ah,
by the jurisdiction where the court sits. And so you can have actions taken by the court to remedy or address contempt that's happening before the court, and then at the same time or subsequently, the court could refer the behavior to the state bar authorities for discipline, and
okay.
also make a recommendation if it's Department of Justice lawyers that the Department of Justice's own internal professional responsibility office investigate.
I mean, it makes for a fascinating case study in a law school class. This is not something you want to actually live through in real life. It's shocking.
It is shocking, and I think that part of what's so difficult here is that there are legal arguments that might be plausible on some other set of facts. For example, it may well be true that the courts have to be careful about not intruding on the foreign affairs powers of the executive branch, and that the US government does not always have full control over what another sovereign country does within its borders. But that said, that's not the case here. When we have an individual who was sent to El Salvador at the express direction and by the hand of the United States government and is being held in a prison pursuant to a contract paid for by the US government, and the president of El Salvador was in the Oval Office last week. And so you have this real sort of disconnect between the facts and what is obvious on the face of what's happening and sort of the legal arguments that are being presented in this sort of abstract way to the courts.
Oh, thank you so much for breaking it down. I just want to repeat for the audience. I think what we're looking for next is the discovery that's going to happen in the next 2 weeks, and or to see if they appeal to the Supreme Court and if the Supreme Court takes it up or grants a stay or something. Yes, did I get it right, Professor?
That's correct.
Okay. I am so grateful for your time and your calm with these complicated questions. You help so many of us understand. Thank you.
My pleasure.